Hi, everyone. Michael Cavacini here, and I'm happy today to be interviewing Stephen Jones. Stephen is a horror writer, editor, and anthologist. He's a Hugo Award nominee. He's the winner of 4 World Fantasy Awards, 3 International Horror Guild Awards, 5 Bram Stoker Awards, and 21 British Fantasy Awards, and a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Horror Writers Association. In other words, he's super successful, and I'm really happy to have him here to
Ha!
speak.
Well, thank you for having me, Michael. I'm not sure super successful is actually right. Stephen King is super successful. Most people have never heard of me, and that's kind of the way I like it, to be honest with you. I just like the work. I do it for the work. But if I was super successful, I probably wouldn't be living in this office here in North London. I'd be living in Los Angeles.
Well, I'm sorry to blow your cover by exposing you to the world through this interview, but no, thank you for speaking with me. Honestly, what caught my attention with you is that as I mentioned before we jumped on the line here, that I first noticed you when I was watching the Leviathan documentary about the making of Hellraiser. And we're going to get into some of your books momentarily, but kind of tell me about that, your career and your involvement with, Hellraiser, working with Clive Barker, just kind of how all that came to be.
Yeah, that was quite further on in the career. I mean, I was just a normal school kid. I grew up reading from science fiction and comics and monster magazines and all that kind of stuff. I'm an absolute monster kid of the '60s. I grew up reading Forrest Jackman's famous Monsters of Filmland. We obviously weren't allowed to see those kind of films in this country in England in those days. They were mostly X certificate. So the only way you could actually read about or see stills from Vincent Price movies or Christopher Lee movies or Boris Karloff movies was reading the magazines, because they weren't being shown on TV back then. There was no home video. You could probably buy the Super 8 little 200-foot reels of film, which I did have, which I used to show, in my bedroom, in my parents' house. But I just loved the stuff. And from reading science fiction, I went into fantasy. Robert E. Howard, Lynn Carter, people like that. And then from that, I moved across to horror with people like, I know, H.P. Lovecraft and Ramsey Campbell. And that's where I kind of stuck. And I became a big horror fan. When I finished school, and I was expelled from school. I say that as a badge of honor, because I was expelled for all the wrong reasons. I went to work in the TV industry in London's Soho area, which was a pretty disreputable area in those days, in the early '70s. But I got in at the very beginning of the video boom. Video was just coming in the early '70s. I ended up co-running a studio, a little private studio in Soho, where we did commercial tests and documentary stuff. I worked with people like John Cleese and all these kind of people. It was kind of interesting back then. And for somebody who was barely 20, barely out of their teens, it was an amazing experience. And from there, I was given the opportunity to get my director's ticket and become a full-time TV director, which I did. At the same time, around about that period, I was now working and producing my own fanzines and small press magazines, and working with the British Fantasy Society and people like that. And then meeting a lot of these people I'd been reading. I mean, the great thing, was I was networking at conventions. I was hanging out with people like Brian Lumley and Ramsey Campbell in those days, and then a little bit later on, people like Clive Barker. And that all was going on. It was all fine. Then I started getting into film journalism, and I worked for Cine Fantastique magazine and Starburst magazine and some of the more professional magazines, Hammer's Halls of Horror. And I was traveling, and one of my friends in Los Angeles, one of the most fabulous horror short story writers ever, Dennis Etchison, would let me stay at his place in LA when I went over to LA. And one of his friends was John Carpenter. And one day Dennis said, "Look, do you want to interview John? He's finishing up Big Trouble in Little China. And I could get you in there. We do an interview with him, go for lunch with him afterwards, and whatever." I said, "That'd be great. I'd love to." So Dennis set all this up. We went along to the 20th Century Fox studio, or backlot, I guess it was, to lunch. The three of us went to lunch afterwards, and I was just chatting to John, and he said to me something like, "Oh, Steve, why don't you come out to LA? You work in television, you work in this kind of stuff. You're a film journalist. You know what you're doing. You're writing." And I said, "Well, look, John, the thing is, back in England, I'm kind of like in a good position. Whereas out here in LA, everybody wants to do that. That's what everybody wants to get on that bandwagon." And he said, "Well, you're perfect for being a film publicist because you can write, the stuff, advertising, all that background as well." And I went, "Oh." He said, "Have you ever thought about it?" I said, "No. I mean, I've obviously worked with film publicists when I've gone down on film sets and dealt with them. But to be honest, they were never very good. They were pretty much corporate people. They weren't really that interested, especially in the sort of films I was interested in. It was just like, oh, we've got to show these people around and let them loose on the set and that kind of thing." So I thought, okay. So when I got back to London, I phoned up Clive, who by that point I knew was a friend who also lived in North London. And I said, "Clive, you're doing some kind of little horror movie, aren't you? Do you have a film publicist?" And he said, "No, Steve, we can't afford one. We haven't got enough money in the budget to have a film publicist." And I said, "Well, look, what if I took 3 months off my job?" Because by then I co-owned the TV company I was working for. I said, I'll take 3 months off and I'll come do it for free." And he said, "Well, that would be great." He said, "But we don't know, I don't know. I can't do that because I'm the director. So let me link you up with the producer, with a guy called Christopher Figg. And we set up a meeting not far from my office in London, in the West End of London. And we went for a drink. And he said, "Look," he said, "it sounds great. I'd love to use you, Steve." He said, "But I'm not letting you do it for free. I'll pay you the minimum we can pay you for doing the job." I said, "Well, if you want to, that's fine." And that's how I got the job of working on Hellraiser. But what I did was I changed everything. I mean, I came into that job from the point of view of a journalist. So I knew what journalists really should be getting on films. And if you're working on a low budget film, and Hellraiser was a low budget film, trust me, you want to try and make some kind of impact. You want to try and make some kind of impact on the journalists so they remember you. So I set this whole thing up. We did badges, we did T-shirts. I had a press kit already made up so that when they came down, instead of them having to go away and then wait another 6 months till the press kit came out, they were given a press kit with interview quotes, cast and credit information, and that was updated all the way through the production. There were opportunities to have filmed interviews. Because of my TV background, I did EPK electronic press kits for the films I worked on. And in fact, on Hellraiser, which was the first film I did, and I did a budget. We managed to afford it. I got a video crew in, one of my crews I worked with, for 3 days. But because I was filming it, I had to find somebody who would interview everybody who would be off camera, sitting behind the camera doing the interview. And that turned out to be Neil Gaiman. So it was Neil Gaiman asking the questions behind the camera, which we then cut him out, which of course was a mistake in retrospect. I just had the interviews with the actors and production people. But yeah, it was great. And the thing about it was Hellraiser was filmed pretty much about 3 miles from where I'm sitting now. So in the morning, I would get up, I'd get on my tube train, I'd go a few stops on the underground, get off, walk up the hill at Dollis Hill, and I'd be on the set of Hellraiser. And I thought all films would be like that. It was so easy to work on. It wasn't. But the great thing was that when Hellraiser finally came out a year later in 1987, I'd done all the groundwork. I'd done special stills so we could offer magazines exclusive cover photos to use on their magazines if they ran an article or a competition. We'd done all sorts of extra things. Everybody knew what was going on. I kept in touch with all the journalists, many of whom were friends of mine anyway. And so basically for a little movie being put out, by New World Pictures on a pretty low budget, we had a lot of stuff. I mean, lots of color. I think we shot something like 700 color transparencies, probably over 1,000 black and white stills. We had 7 hours of video footage behind the scenes. We had all this stuff ready to go. And I think, I mean, obviously, one of the reasons that Hellraiser was so successful was it was remarkable for its time. It was groundbreaking in 1987. But I like to think I helped a little bit in setting that up and getting it noticed by the genre, and especially by the genre press. And it worked so well. And that's when I first met Pete Atkins, because he came down on set. He was an old school friend of Clive's. And then I went on to work on Hellraiser 2 and Hellraiser 3. So it was quite nice. It was like working on Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, and Son of Frankenstein. I did the first trilogy.
Yeah.
I think they're up to number 14 now or something. But back then it was kind of special.
Well, that's one of the things that really caught my eye when I was watching the Leviathan documentary, and I mentioned this to Pete when I interviewed him, is that it very much seemed like for those first few movies, including Nightbreed, that it was.
Oh yeah, I worked on Nightbreed as well. Yeah.
It almost seemed like it was like a little family working together on
the
films.
It was certainly Hellraiser 1, Hellraiser 2, very much so. It was basically the same cast and crew. I mean, you know, we didn't actually shoot them back to back, but we shot them within a year of each other. Things got a little bit more complicated with Nightbreed, which was made in 1990. Again, it was shot at Pinewood Studios, again, not far from where I am now. It had a much bigger budget. We had a really reasonable budget for that one. It was a much bigger film than the one that finally came out with, you know, as Nightbreed. It was much more epic in scope originally, but the problem was studio interference on that, and it got to a point a few weeks into production where the American production company, Morgan Creek, stepped in. They got rid of our producer, Christopher Figg, and brought their own American producer in, who was great, who was absolutely fine. But it wasn't quite the same feel from that point. It became a bit more of a corporate movie, a bit more of a studio movie. And then when Fox got hold of it, as you probably know by talking to Pete Atkins, they screwed up the publicity totally on the film. They cut lots of it out. I remember seeing it at the 20th Century Fox offices in London, the preview screening with the press. And the first thing I was like, where's the first 20 minutes of this movie? It's gone. This is not what I saw with Clive, you know, at Pinewood. This is like a bowdlerized version of the movie. And I don't think it's ever been put back to how it was. And then it was decided that the Hellraiser movies would be filmed in America from number 3 onwards. But they very kindly took me over to do Hellraiser 3 Hell on Earth in North Carolina. And that was a great experience, because that was basically me and Pete and Bob Keane, who did the special effects, were all plonked down in North Carolina at the Dino De Laurentiis studio. And we just made Hellraiser out there. It was a really fun experience.
So you mentioned publicity for Nightbreed, and it made me think of Halloween Ends, because I was talking to an author recently, and he made a good point. He said that the marketing, because he hadn't seen Halloween Ends, but I explained the situation to him, how they were basically marketing it and promoting it as this is the epic conclusion to the Michael Myers, Laurie Strode, you know, feud, whatever.
Yeah.
And then when people got to the theater where they saw the movie, Michael Myers was barely in it, and it was all about this kid who you never saw before until this movie. So the author was saying to me, oh, when you're a writer, you need to, if you make a promise to the reader, you need to fulfill that promise. And he's like, and it sounds like the marketing and promotion for that movie was making a promise that it never fulfilled. You know, what are your thoughts on how Halloween Ends was marketed and promoted, and then kind of that bait and switch with what it was?
I think it happens too often. I mean, I've done a lot of movie books over the years, and if you look at the publicity on movies, it can often be very misleading. I was okay with the last 3 films. I thought the middle one was the weakest, actually, because it was just a bridging movie. I think they did. I mean, I'm not a great fan of this remaking, or sequels and prequels and all the rest of it. You know, I think there's so much in my genre, in the horror genre alone, or even science fiction genres even more. There's so much material out there that never gets touched. Nobody ever reads it. Nobody adapts it. They just keep remaking the same thing over and over again. And pretty much every time they remake it, it gets a little bit worse. I mean, look at the new Firestarter this year. What was the point of that? I mean, I don't understand it. But what you were saying is quite interesting, because one of the things I decided to do when I got into publishing in the well, technically mainstream publishing, late 80s, was I decided to take control of my career and not allow that to happen, because although it happens in film, it also happens in books and publishing. And I said, no, I want to reach a stage where I design my own covers, where I write my own copy. If necessary, I do my own publicity. Because I don't trust the publishers to do it, because you're just one very small cog in a very large wheel moving around. And if you're in horror, you're in a very, very small cog, and it's, you know, they really don't care. I mean, I'm a middle. I was a middleist writer. I'm not anymore, because there's no such thing as the middleist left in mainstream publishing. But for many years in the 80s and 90s, I was a middleist published author, which meant I did okay. My books sold. We made money. They came back. We did more books, and that's how we did it. And it ticked over like that. Everybody was happy. And then you got to a point where publishers bought up other publishers, and I used to have 5 separate publishers in London. They now all owned by the same publisher. So it doesn't say, well, I've done 5 books back in the day, I could then do 1, and then they stopped doing horror, unless it was Stephen King or the big budget, the big bestseller type stuff. And of course, that's not what I've ever wanted to do. I've just wanted to do really good books. And I've always said, if you put your name to something, whether it's a film director, whether it's a TV director, whether it's an artist, whether it's a poet, whether it's a writer, whether it's an editor, you've got to be able to stand by it. You must be able to stand by that work. And of course, if that work is taken away from you and it's changed, or it's screwed up with a terrible cover, let's say, or a terrible movie poster, which is what happened to Nightbreed, it's not your fault. But nobody cares at the end of the day. Literally nobody cares about that at the end of the day. All they care about is the final product. They don't know if there were reshoots, if it took extra year to come out, if there was trouble behind the scenes. Nobody cares. All they care about is the final product. And so the more control you can have over that final product, hopefully, the better it's going to be. Because I'm a great believer. I believe in the auteur theory that nobody knows their project better than the person creating it. So if I'm doing an anthology, let me write the blurb on the back of the book. I mean, obviously, somebody can come in and tweak it and change it and whatever afterwards. But I know that book better than anybody, because I spent 8 months of my life working on it. Let me design the cover of the book, because I know pretty much all the artists. I'm very good in design background anyway, from my advertising and fanzine background. And let me design the cover, because I know what the cover should look like. It shouldn't be a blurry photograph of a knife in the shower or something. It should be something that fits the book. So you're not cheating the reader when they come to buy the book. They can look at the cover, they can read the blurb, and they go, oh, I get it. This is what this book is about. I totally get it. I understand it. And that should be true of films as well. It should be true of everything, to be honest. And it's not. I've never done a book under a pseudonym. I know I've got friends who have, for various reasons. But I've always said, no, if you're proud about something, if you want to do it, stand by it at the end of the day, which is what I think all creative people should do.
Yeah, absolutely. So Clive Barker, he's just a person who's always fascinated me. Like I said, I recently interviewed Pete Atkins. I recently interviewed Douglas E. Winter, who wrote Clive's official biography back.
Yeah, I know Doug very well. Yeah.
Yeah, and now just recently, Phil and Sarah Stokes released the Clive Barker's Dark Worlds, which is almost like a new book, kind of celebrating his career. And it just came out around the same time that Stephen King had a similar book come out, and I interviewed the author of that, Bev Vincent. And so Clive and Stephen King have always kind of fascinated me, because they're both really fascinating individuals, really creative. So Clive, I mean, how did you, from what I've learned about the people he worked with on Hellraiser 1 and 2, and it seems like he met a lot of people through theater and things like that. His theater company. I mean, is that how you kind of,
No,
cross
not at
paths, or
all.
did you cross paths some other way?
Yeah, totally a different way. Clive lived in Liverpool, which is a long way. It's a city a long way away from here. Um, uh, uh, a lot of theatre came from that. He had a theatre troupe. A lot of them were school friends of his who were in the theatre. Um, you know, basically, he ran this for years. He was the guy putting it together, drawing the posters, all that kind of stuff. While he was a school kid, unbelievably, and still at school, Ramsey Campbell, who's a mutual friend of ours, horror writer, probably one of the best horror writers in the world, went to visit his school and give a little talk about writing and writing horror. And after the thing was over and the talk was over, Clive apparently went up and approached Ramsey and had a little conversation with him and said how interested he was in horror and whatever. And they got to become friends. And so when Clive moved down to London in the 1980s, this is before the Books of Blood had even come out, he told Clive to look me up in London, because by then I was already doing book stuff, horror stuff. And so Clive did. Clive got in contact, and I met up with him, and we became friends. And I can remember now he came around to this house and was eating chili off his lap while signing the first editions of Books of Blood in paperback when they came out. And I've still got those copies downstairs, on the shelves. Luckily, with no chili on them, which is good. Yeah, I mean, I was a guest in his house. He would throw parties when the books came out, quite incredible parties actually at his house. It was fun, so we got to know each other. So as I say, when the opportunity came to work with him on Hellraiser, I just literally phoned him up and said, I'm around if you want me, and it all worked out quite well. I mean, you got to remember that Clive was the director on the first one. He was a producer on the second one. He was kind of an executive producer on the third one, maybe the fourth one as well, which I wasn't involved with. And then again, they kind of moved it away from him or whatever. And it's madness to me that Clive Barker, it's one of those things where John Carpenter does the music maybe on the new Halloween movies and gets an executive producer credit, but I doubt he gets much creative control over it. I mean, certainly with Hellraiser, but I mean, Clive cleverly kept the publishing rights, but he couldn't keep the film rights, the sequel rights, or whatever. So his level of control was, I mean, again, he was involved in both Hellraiser 2 and Hellraiser 3 to the extent that I sat in preview theaters with him and the directors and the producers, and we went through things and looked at things and changed things, and he had input into at least the first three Hellraisers. He was there looking after them, let's say. But yeah, no, we met through the literary side of things. And he worked I used to run a magazine called Fantasy Tales here before I became a professional editor, and he contributed to that a couple of times. No, we were friends. We were just friends, and we knew the literary scene, and we met through our mutual friend Ramsey Campbell.
Yeah, it's great. Clive, I mean, how would you you're obviously a writer yourself, you appreciate hard writing. To me, I think, and I haven't read everything he's written, 10 times or anything, but I think, to me, the part that I find most impressive about his writing is his willingness not to hold back. Like some authors you would think might be like, I don't want to get that dark, that, what are people going to think of me if I say something that, like, vivid or explicit, but he'll go there, but he'll go there in a way where it's worded in such a creative way that, like, you can't, like, I was literally on my wife and I, she was pregnant, we're on a baby moon in the Bahamas, and I'm reading the Books of Blood, and I'm reading I don't know, Sex, Death, and Starshine or something, and there's just some description of these two guys like doing something sexual, and I'm laughing, and she's like, what are you laughing about? I'm like, this is like, the way this is worded is like amazing. I was like, you don't even need to be gay to appreciate this. You can just read this and go, holy hell, like what a way to describe that, right? He just had such a way with words and still does, and would just let it all hang out, that I was just like, man, like how did he construct that sentence? And just like, it's just so remarkable, his ability to be creative with words in a way where a lot of people can be pretty, pedestrian in the way they describe something, but not him. And I just think
I think that's what makes people like Clive and Ramsey and Dennis Etchison and Peter Straub and Stephen King stand out from the rest of the crowd. I mean, they can write, they know their craft. I think the impressive thing about Clive was that he knew his craft when he entered the field. When the first 3 books of Blood were published simultaneously over here, nobody had read anything like them before. I mean, they just basically blew everything else out the water. Because of that very reason, he was not willing to hold back. I mean, he literally pushed the envelope. I mean, one of the little button badges I had made up for Hellraiser was simply "There are no limits," and that was what we used to sell Hellraiser, because that came out of the kind of fiction Clive was doing with the Books of Blood. He did it with the Damnation Game, his first novel, that kind of stuff. But also, you've got to remember the other thing about Clive is he was a playwright. He's a terrific painter, artist. He is a filmmaker, and he's an author of short stories and novels. That's a pretty wide scope of things to be. Stephen King directed one movie and never directed a movie again. It was just too much for him. But Clive actually has a grasp of all of those elements, of all of those things. But with the Books of Blood, you can still go back and read those stories from the mid-1980s now, and they stand up as well to now as they did back then. And they're still in print. Those books have never been out of print ever again. And as you say, I mean, Clive still writes not as much now, and that's fair enough. I think none of us quite do as many books as we used to. That's fair. Clive's literally 1 year older than I am. But yeah, I mean, we're all slowing down a little bit. We want to do other kind of things. And God bless him if he wants to do the art books and then the art and all that kind of stuff. That's what he wants to get into, stay in now, and and the odd comic thing, the odd TV thing now and again.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. So boy, I mean, there's just so much with Hellraiser 1, 2, and 3. I guess tell me about kind of your favorite memories from Hellraiser, that trilogy. Anything that really stands out for you is just kind of the happiest, funniest, or moments that stayed with you.
I think it's one really good story. It does involve Peter Atkins, and it's a story that he always tells me as well. When we were working out at the De Laurentiis Studios in North Carolina, we were a pretty tight unit. And as you probably know, on a movie, you normally shoot in the studio during the day, and then there might be a night shoot as well, where you have to go out and shoot in fields and forests and whatever else. That was particularly true of Nightbreed, by the way, where there was a lot of night shooting because of the battles and explosions and things like that. And the problem about being the unit publicist is you obviously have to be there for both units. So I'd work maybe an 8, 9, 10, 11, 12-hour day while they were filming the studio, and then that unit would go home, and I would still have to go out with the night unit to see what they were doing and what they were shooting. And that was also the point where basically LA came online and I could talk to the American press and whatever. So I was working very long days. I mean, some days I didn't get home till 3 a.m. And on Hellraiser 3, I remember one incident where we literally had worked all day. It was a really tough day. Then we went out with the night unit, and we were filming in fields of corn, if I remember correctly. It was like big cornfields, and it's cold at night in North Carolina. Anyway, we shot all that stuff, several hours out there. We are heading back to the motel we were all staying in, because they put us all in one big motel, which was great. And then what was great is there would be literally cases of beer waiting for us when we got back to just calm down a little bit before we started work 4 hours, 5 hours later. And I remember one day when it was this really tough day, and we were in the car, and I'm in the back of the car with Pete Atkins, and we're riding back. And just as we're riding back, the sun starts to come up over the cornfields in North Carolina. And I went, hey, Pete, look at that. Isn't that just the most beautiful thing you've ever seen? That sun rising over the cornfields. And he looked at me and they did a double take. And he said, where's Stephen Jones and what have you done with him? Because he just couldn't believe I was waxing so lyrical about something like a sunrise. But it was just so lovely to see. But yeah, I mean, I can remember hanging out on the craft bus with Ken Cranham and then the cast of Hellraiser 2. And as I say, we were a big family. We were just one big family. Certainly on Hellraiser 2, I was a bug wrangler. I mean, they called me as a bug wrangler with all the cockroaches. So basically, they stored the cockroaches in plastic tubs in my fridge in my trailer. And then when we filmed those scenes, we had to build a wall around where the scene was being shot to stop the cockroaches from escaping. Because if we allowed them to get out, they would get into the rafters and under the floors at Pinewood Studios. You never get rid of them. So we always had to count them in and count them out. And part of my job was actually making sure that none of the cockroaches escaped while we were filming those scenes. And I don't like bugs. I might be a horror guy, but I don't like bugs. And cockroaches, these were African cockroaches, so they were this big. And I can remember when they put them in the fridge in my office to quiet them down, because when they get cold, they become dormant almost. And I literally can remember taking these plastic boxes out of my fridge, taking to the studio. And you could hear the cockroaches going as their hard bodies moved over each other. It was the most disgusting sound I've ever heard. But yeah, one of my jobs I thought I'd never be was a cockroach wrangler. So there you are.
That is, it's like if you're in a room with people and they say, "Tell us something interesting about yourself." That's your story. Pretty crazy.
It's a pretty well. Again, we all. I mean, as much as we could, with unions and stuff like that, and that wasn't a big problem in North Carolina, which I think is a non-union state. But certainly here in England, the film industry is very union regulated. But if we could help, if we could chip in, if we could make things easier for people, we did when we could. Everybody, as I say, it was like one big family. It was fabulous.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, from what I've heard, they originally envisioned that Claire Higgins' character was going to be the villain in the Hellraiser. They didn't necessarily assume that, even though Pinhead was obviously on the poster. From what I understand, she was originally supposed to be, the one that
she was the through character.
Over, right?
She was the through character. Yeah, I mean, to give you a great example of that, I mean, if you look at the first Hellraiser, the Cenobites are in it for about 5 or 6 minutes, the whole movie. When I was doing the publicity, we certainly never concentrated on the Cenobites. We concentrated on Claire Higgins' character and skinned Frank coming back and having the skin put back on him by her murders. And she was really the star of the movie. She was the person that the whole film was meant to be about. She was the character who came back obviously for the second one. But this was interesting actually, because at the time we were making it, there were no poster concepts out there. I guess that all happened after they saw the movie, and there were reshoots on Hellraiser, even out some of the horror sequences, put some more stuff in. The birth of Frank was all added later from under the floorboards, which is normal for a movie. I mean, you normally do reshoots and pickups and things like that as well. Some scenes had to be reshot while we were doing our filming, because back in America, back in Los Angeles, New World thought it was too British, and we had to kind of make it in this place which was neither Britain or Canada or America. It had to be like nowhere land. So there were reshoots for that, and there was some dubbing. Some of the characters are overdubbed to give them American accents and things like that. Which is a shame, really, because one of the things I loved about Hellraiser, and one of the reasons I got into it, is I'm a huge fan of British horror. I was a big fan of Hammer and Amicus. And I remember saying to Clive at the time, I saw this as a way of British horror cinema coming back at the end of the 80s, early 90s, and almost a renaissance of that kind of horror movie, which hadn't been around for a long time. All those big studios had gone by the mid-70s, and if it had been filmed as a British horror movie rather than just being filmed in Britain, I think it would have had, I don't know, maybe not as much commercial reach initially, but over a period of time, I think it would have become a lot more respected. I think it would have been much more of a cult movie. I know it's a cult movie now, but it's a flawed cult movie. And that's why in Hellraiser 2, when you look at the policemen and people like this, they're wearing like Canadian police uniforms and things, or but there's no badges or nothing on them. There's like a blue band, I think, around their hats. It was a way of kind of softening what was going on. Whereas by the time you hit Hellraiser 3, it's very much set in America and whatever. But yeah, I mean, I didn't get it, and I guess they did some research and screenings, and Doug Bradley's Pinhead was the thing that everybody remembered from the first movie. And they went, right, let's put him on the movie posters. And the photos they used of Doug with the chains and Doug holding the lament configuration box, they were all shot later. They were specially shot for the posters, and that was the American marketing campaign, and that went worldwide. And I guess that established them so that by the second one, there's a lot more of the Cenobites, and by the third one, it is just the Cenobites of the villains and whatever.
Yeah.
Although we did manage to bring Kirsty back in the third one for a little bit, which was kind of fun as well.
Yeah, I've met Ashley Lawrence and Claire Higgins, and Claire Higgins is actually my favorite part of the movie. I think that I told her, I said, I could just tell by watching your body language that you were a stage actress, because like there's a one shot in the original Hellraiser where she's at the top of the stairs and she has like her hand on the banister, and she's like lit in a way where she looks really evil. And Ashley Lawrence is, she's, calling her Julia, and she's not responding. And they just show her there looking down, all menacing. And I was just like, I could just tell by that moment that this is a stage actress, because she didn't have to say a word, but you just felt it. And she's just phenomenal in that role. And it's funny to see interviews with her, and she like isn't really a horror fan, kind of can't stomach it, but she was this despicable character.
Yeah, no, I mean, she's now sort of like a grand dame of the stage here, and she's still doing stage work here in England now. And Kenneth Cranham's the same. I mean, when you look at the second one, as Dr. Chenard, he also brings that sort of actorly presence, that sort of Christopher Lee moment to that role, and basically plays it. He knows what he's in, he knows what he's playing, but he brings a gravitas to the role, and it's great to see those two on the screen as well. When they're together on the screen, it lifts Hellraiser 2 out of the average popcorn movie into something a little bit better, I think.
Absolutely. So I'm curious, before we dive into these books here, I see a photo of you on your website with Stephen King. Do you have a Stephen King connection? And if so, what is it?
No connection, other than the fact I've met him several times. I knew him when his career was just starting out. I first interviewed Steve in 1979 at the World Fantasy Convention in Texas. Carrie was out, and Carrie came out, obviously it was his first book, and he did a launch party here in London for it when it came out in paperback. And as a journalist, I went to that and I met him. I got him to sign my copy of Carrie at that party. And when I got home, I opened it up and it said, to Jeff Jones with best wishes, Stephen King. I'm like, what? Say what? Jeff Jones is an artist. He's not me. And so many years later, when I was with Steve again at an event, I actually took it up to him, and he went, "Oh shit!" And he just crossed out Jeff and wrote Steve, whatever. But then we met up at various times, and I think, what was this, the third World Fantasy Convention in 79 or 78, 79 in Texas. He literally, the Stand was about to come out. Preview copies of the Stand were available, but the book hadn't actually been published yet. And he was at a loose end for breakfast. And so we were all going down in the elevator together. And I said, do you want to like do an interview over breakfast for a magazine? He said, sure. So me and a group of friends just sat with Steve and I interviewed him. And the interview came out in a magazine here called Fantasy Media. And it's been reprinted numerous times in books over the years. And we sort of like, we like everything. I mean, we are a family. The horror writers, editors are a family. You mentioned Doug Winter, you mentioned Pete Atkins, I mentioned Ramsey Campbell and Brian Lumley and James Herbert and Stephen King and Peter Straub. We all know each other. We all hang out. We used to hang out together. We used to go for drinks in the bar. We were on panels together. We all gave each other awards at various different times. All that kind of stuff. And Steve's done stuff for books of mine in the past. He's done introductions and allowed me to publish stories and that kind of thing. No, he's just a working writer, and he's one of hundreds of working genre writers that I, as an editor, it's my job to know. I've been very lucky because I came into this in my teens, and so I got to not only meet the old school writers, the people who worked for Weird Tales, the old pulp magazines like Robert Bloch and Fritz Leiber and Manny Wade Wellman and all those guys, Frank Belknap Long. I used to meet all of those guys and knew those guys. Then I got to know the new people, the Dennis Etchisons, Clive Barkers, Ramsey Campbells, Carl Edward Wagner's, all those kind of guys. And since then, I've moved on, and Neil Gaiman and Kim Newman and Michael Marshall Smith and those, and the new generation. I'm now working with people who weren't even born when I started working in the genre, and that's a great thing. I mean, I've been very lucky. My career has lasted 45, 50 years, and so I've spanned all those different groups at different times, and I've managed to work with pretty much all of them. I don't think there's anybody in the genre who, certainly in literature, who I've wanted to work with, who I've not worked with, to be honest, who was alive at the time. I mean, obviously, I'd love to have met H.P. Lovecraft, but he was dead long before I was around.
That's great.
But I met lots of people who had met H.P. Lovecraft and knew him, so that was kind of interesting. So I was like one person removed.
Yeah, that's why I have conversations like this, because I find it's fascinating to connect.
But I also think it's something, we have a responsibility. I mean, a lot of people come into this stuff and then they go off and do something. They come in, they might make a couple of low budget horror movies or write a couple of horror pot boilers, and then move on to become more important writers or more important filmmakers. And those of us who stuck with it, because we loved it when we came in, didn't want to do anything else, and we've done it all our lives. I think it's our responsibility to a certain extent to bring up the next generation, to help the next generation move up. I mean, I always used to say, you would run out of blood if new blood if we didn't help, we didn't bring new writers into the field. And I certainly with my anthologies, I've always tried to bring new people in. That's how I met Neil. That's how I met Kim Newman. These guys, by publishing, maybe not their first story, but publishing their second or third or fourth story, when they were still starting out and people didn't really know who they were. So and then of course they go on, and in turn they help people move up and things, and that's how it works. I mean, unfortunately, back then we had a publishing industry. We don't actually have a publishing industry anymore, and that's one of the major problems.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm working on a book myself, which I plan on self-publishing. Mainly back to what you were saying earlier about being able to control it. Like, I think absolutely I could get a traditional publisher on board, but then they would tell me to make it shorter or to change this or change that, or I wouldn't retain the rights. And I don't want to do that. But yeah, it's a whole different world. And speaking of published books, I do want to highlight 3 that you have here that I have copies in front of me. So one is The Art of Horror Movies. So this is a book that came to my attention that I was like, oh, I have to check that out. And I'm sure you probably helped design this cover, which caught my attention.
I did. I helped design the cover. Yeah, that's the new edition which came out this year, isn't it? That's the revised edition. Yeah, we added another 60 pages to it. It did very well, and it was the second of a trilogy I've done of The Art of Horror. Have you got the other ones? Have you seen the other ones?
I do. So the other 2, for people who are watching, is we've got The Art of Horror.
Right, that was the first one. When that they came to me on that one. They said, "Look, we want somebody to do The Art of Horror. Would you be interested? And I said, yeah, sure, but I want to do it this way. And it was it was very much, it was a packager. It wasn't even the publisher, it was a packager. And it was very unlike any other book they'd done before. I wanted to do something a little bit special with it, a little bit different with it, which we did. And it worked well. And then from that, I pitched the movie book, which is certainly the best one, I think, of the three, because I love movies. And we got some I mean, you should show the images. The images inside, full color throughout, heavy paper, lots of amazing contributors, including original artists. And then the third one, I wanted to do a book, basically the art of horror literature. And my packagers said nobody will understand what the word literature means in a title. So I said, well, let's just call it the art of pulp horror then, and we'll just get around it that way, which came out. It was good. I was quite pleased with it. I mean, it's got the most interesting selection of artwork in it, and it covers film, it covers books, it covers magazines, it covers paperbacks, it covers everything. So if you put those three books together, there, Michael, it's basically one book. It's all basically one giant encyclopedia of horror, but I just had to break it down into 3 volumes. And I'm immensely proud of it. I mean, I'm working on a 4th book this year, probably, or next year, which is not going to be in quite the same format. Again, I was happy to make it the 4th of the Art of Horror books. It would have fitted the format very well, but the packager said, no, we don't want it that way. We want a different kind of book. So it will come out in a slightly different format with a slightly different title, but it will technically be the 4th book in the series. I'm not telling you what it's about yet.
All right, we'll have to wait and see. So when it comes to putting together a book like this, the art of horror movies, horror or pulp horror, I mean, these are substantial books. So are you writing all the copy? Are you editing it? I mean, are you laying it out? I mean, how much of it are you doing, and how long does it take for something this big to be completed from start to finish?
The packager basically gives me 8 months, start to finish. I've got to do the whole thing. So one of the things is I get well-known writers to write the individual chapters in each book. Sometimes the same people come back and do different chapters. So I've got the same pool of writers writing different chapters in each book. And then we get somebody a guest person to write the introduction. Neil Gaiman did the first one. John Landis did the movie one. My friend Robert Silverberg, the science fiction writer, did the 3rd one. So we tried to find somebody to write the introduction. I put together get the guys to put together the essays. I give them a guide. I tell them what I need, what we need to cover in the essays. They will do me the essays. I then write all the captions. I write all the little mini articles, which may be 4 or 5 paragraphs inside. I do all the front material, all the end material, and I lay out the book. I literally choose every single image and say where it should go on the page and how big it should be on the page. And then I write the back copy as well.
Wow, yeah, but it sounds
but like it comes out of being. Think of me as the editor or the compiler, as being the director. And think of the pictures as being the cinematography, and think of the writers as being the actors. And you can apply this to anything you do. If you've worked in movies or TV, it's the same skills. Is what I said at the very beginning of this interview. You're just using the same skills. Instead of putting together a movie, and a book is very similar to a movie, it has to have peaks and troughs. It has to flow. It has to tell a story. It has to make sense. It has to have a beginning, a middle, and an end, hopefully in that order. And so when you're constructing a book, be it an anthology, a short story collection, a non-fiction book like the Art of Horror books, you have to think about all that when you're putting it together. Which chapter should come first? Which chapter should come last? If I use this image here, how do I come back to that later on in the book? Maybe there's all this kind of thing. Even the end papers. I mean, those end papers you're looking at there now in the book, which I've got one here. Because you're blurred, so some of that's kind of blurry. So things like the end papers, just things like this, are from my own collection. A lot of this stuff is from my own collection. So, these things. So that's an ad that Universal did in the 30s for a Boris Karloff movie that never came out. It was never made.
Right.
But I actually have a copy of that original So it was easier to just reshoot it and put it into the book. And so a lot of the material, I mean, there's the original paintings, of course, but a lot of the posters and the press kits and all this other stuff, that's mine. That comes from my collection. As you can see behind me, this is just my working office. And, these are magazines and books and movie stills and press kits and all sorts of stuff.
Wow, that's pretty incredible. So when you're doing, I know I think the Art of Horror movies specifically, I think it's chronological, if I'm correct. But for, I think, pulp horror, it's not necessarily chronological. So how do you know when you go into something, if you're writing pretty much some sort of historical account about a topic, if you're not going to do it chronologically, how do you decide how to do it in a way where it makes sense to the reader? For like, oh, the flow of this makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's the biggest. There's two major things about putting any project together, whether it be film, whether it be TV, whether it be a book. Start with the title first, because everything comes from the title. When I'm looking at short stories, if I get a short story and it's called The Vampire, I know it's going to be pretty terrible because somebody hasn't thought about that title. If, on the other hand, they've got a title that hooks me, I go, oh, that's interesting. I wonder what this story's about. And it turns out to be a vampire at the end. You caught me. You got me. So the title of any book or any story is hugely important. And people just go, oh, I'll just put a title on it. No, you got to think about the title. That's the first thing. That's the first hook. The second is the structure, whether it be a movie, a book, or whatever. And so to that end, you do basically a breakdown of the book, like you would storyboard a movie. That's why movies are storyboarded, because it's a way of seeing, will it work in this sequence? Will these sequences all work? And you build it up storyboard by storyboard by storyboard with concept art. So when I'm putting together any book, I do maybe 2-3 pages of a breakdown of the book before I ever start it. So, and then that gets tweaked as you go along, because there'll be things you go, oh, wait a minute, that will work better if we turn that around, or we do that, and whatever. And that's the stage I'm at with the fourth book at the moment. I'm basically doing all the research, the background stuff, getting a feel of how it's going to be laid out, what the chapters are going to be involved. And with the art books, particularly, the movie books, you actually don't only break them down into chapters, you break them down into double page spreads. And if you look at the double page spreads, everything on those double page spreads flows. So they're like mini books. And I'm limited. Again, I don't understand why, but they limit me to the amount of words I can use. They limit me to the amount of pictures I can use. They limit me to the length of the captions, which I think is ridiculous, because my job is just to make it as interesting, as good as possible, give you as much information and stuff as possible, and to fill the page. But they, for some reason, don't like that. So I'm trapped within their format. But within their format, I get away with quite a lot, to be honest. I push the envelope. There are no limits again. So yeah, I break it down, and I break every double page spread down into the images, the captions, the text. And then it's like a novel. If you anybody who says to me they can't write a novel, all you do is you start off and you write a sentence, and you write a few sentences, you create a paragraph. A paragraph leads to a chapter. You write 20 chapters, you got a novel. That's it. You start small. A film, you break it down into scenes. You shoot one scene, you shoot a second scene, you shoot a third scene, you edit those scenes together. You've got a sequence. The more sequences you have, you make a movie. That's how it works.
And so do you think there's space to kind of blend the two? In other words, where you could have kind of chronological chapters, and then interspersed in between those, you might have ones that are topic focused, right?
Yes, absolutely. As I said, if I was ever given the opportunity to put those 3 books together, into one final book, they wouldn't just be 3 books like that. I'd mix all the chapters up, so that you'd have the chronological ones, you'd have the thematic ones, and remember, some of them actually flow chronologically in a thematic chapter. So the internal part of the chapter is chronological, because it's meant to tell a story of that theme. So you get a lot of that cross-pollination, and it's quite complex. And there's also some images refer to images in later chapters or earlier chapters and things like that. Yeah, it's a lot of work. I would like to take 2 years to do one of these books, but unfortunately, people want them now. You know, it's like, oh, can you do it like in 6 months' time? It's like, no, I've got to research it and find the material and scan it all in and clean. I mean, I scan all my material in and clean up my own material as well. You know, there's a lot of work involved in this, but at the end of the day, it's, as I said earlier, it's got my name on it. So it's got to, I want it to be as good as it possibly can, because this is my heritage. When I'm dead and gone, hopefully these books will still be out there, maybe on the second-hand market, on eBay or whatever. And certainly the art of horror books were always, the plan was that, you know, if you're 12, 13 years old and you're looking for a book on horror and somebody buys, you know, your aunt or your mum and dad buy you one of these for Christmas and it gets you hooked, like I was hooked back when I was 12, 13 years old, then I've done my job. That was the whole point. And if you learn something from it, if you learn who Boris Karloff was, or Bela Lugosi, or Lon Chaney Jr., or Christopher Lee, or Peter Cushing, or anything like that, Vincent Price, then again, I've done my job. I've shown you something, and maybe you want to go off and find, you know, on a streaming service or on a Blu-ray or something like that. I mean, I do a lot of Blu-ray commentaries now as well with Kim Newman, and like Pete Atkins does as well. And that's been a whole eye-opener now. I mean, that's like a second career for me. And I spend a lot of my time now basically doing Blu-ray commentaries on films that I love. I mean, I don't, you know, I only do, again, like everything, I only do it if I particularly want to do it. And so I will do the films I grew up with, the films that I adored when I was a kid or a teenager. I will go back, and hopefully our commentaries give people that same sense of excitement, that same sense of wonder that I got reading, you know, Forry Ackerman's famous Monsters of Filmland in the 1960s. Who again, you know, somebody I eventually ended up meeting and ended up working with in, you know, in later days. I actually had an article in the last issue of Famous Monsters of Filmland with the original run. And then I worked with Forry on a number of projects, including his magazine Monsterland, which was great. So it's great how these connections are made. You know, you make these connections, and hopefully they're for life. You know, it's great, and it all feeds in to what you talk about with Clive: the painting, the writing, the filmmaking, the plays. It's all the same stuff. You know, it's all the creative arts. It's just for us, it's the dark arts. That's all.
Practicing the dark arts. Something that's really interesting about writing a book like this too is that you could read it cover to cover, but then you probably also write it in a way knowing that someone might just pick this up, go to the chapter about vampires or Hellraiser or whatever, and only read that. So they might have 5 minutes to read. They're just jumping in, almost like a reference book. So I guess you have to keep that in your mind as you're putting this together, that this could be read cover to cover or just as reference material.
More so than the anthologies and collections. With a non-fiction book, and particularly a picture book, because these are big coffee table books, that's what they're there for. They are to be dipped into. They are, you know, when you're on a rainy Sunday afternoon, you lay on the couch, flick through it, go, oh, that's interesting. What's that about? Oh, that's nice. That's a good image. Oh, I'll read about this. Whereas with the collections and the anthologies, you still know people do that. They won't read it from cover to cover. You wish they would, because part of my skill as an editor is, like I was saying earlier with the movies, you construct an anthology so it flows. You don't have all the same type of story next to each other. You have different themes, different atmospheres, different scares, whatever you want to do. So you have to build a book that has a flow. But of course, that makes no sense if somebody comes in and reads, you know, the third story in the book first. It's like, and you can't do anything about that. You just got to hope it's a good story. I mean, I did an anthology a few years ago called Terrifying Tales to Tell at Night, which was a series of stories for kids. And again, you know, I very carefully crafted it. So there was a Neil Gaiman story, there was a Stephen King story, there was, you know, different writers contributed stories to the book, and it was illustrated and whatever. But I know kids aren't going to read it from beginning to end. They're just going to go in and, you know, go straight to the Stephen King story first or whatever, because it's like, oh, I can get to read a Stephen King story, you know, and I'm 8 or something. It's a shame. I mean, you know, if people did actually read the books from cover to cover in that order, I think they get more out of it. But it's kind of like people who fast forward through movies, which I've never done, or get up and walk out of a movie after the second act. You know, sometimes you've got to stick with it, because sometimes it gets better towards the end. You know, sometimes a film is redeemed by its last act and its climax. You just never know. But people who fast forward through movies just drive me nuts. And it's the same way as people who fast forward through books. You know, people who just basically skip material or whatever. I don't think you can do that.
No,
I think you can do. I think you should do it. That's all. And also, I think it's unfair to the artist, the writer, the artist, the editor, whatever, because they've spent a lot of time putting that together as to become a thing, an item. And so respect that. Respect it as a piece of art, whether it's self-published, whether it's published by a mainstream press or whatever. And if you're going to go on that journey with them, go on that journey with them. See where it takes you. It might take you somewhere you weren't expecting. Hopefully it will take you somewhere where you weren't expecting. And then maybe next time you see one of their books or films out there, you'll go and see that. And that's how it works. That's how we all survived.
Yeah. So obviously these books are best consumed physically, but have you or the publisher ever considered making them available digitally?
We looked at it, and the problem is the quality of the images, which are all high-res images. It would be huge. It would be a huge file. It would be insanely huge to create it electronically, and it wouldn't look the same. When I tell you, and you probably haven't even noticed this, Michael, but and this is something I've been wanting to do in these books for a long time, and I wasn't allowed to. But on the Art of Pulp Horror and on the revised pages in the Art of Movies, all the captions are the same length for the picture captions, so they run as a line along the bottom. They're not ragged, because I just thought that would look nicer in the book. So I wrote the captions so that when they were printed, I mean, there might be one word over now and again, but if you look underneath the pictures, pretty much all the captions run the same number of lines. So it just creates a barrier. It's all part of the design. It all adds into the design, overall design of the book. And I say that's why I like to design my covers, my logos, my back covers, my copy, everything. It's all part and parcel of the same book. And it should be part of the reading experience. I mean, I love books. I love books because they're tactile. I love books because you can hold them, you can read them, you can file them on the shelves, you can look at the spines, you can take them out and touch them. I mean, I collect old books as well. I collect secondhand books as well. So I've always been a big book collector since I was a kid. And so I'm not a great fan of electronic books. I can understand why some people want to read them. But yeah, unfortunately, those books would never work because there's so many elements, there's so many things that play in the book, even down to the quality of the paper and the quality of the images, that they would never work. And that's why I don't think we'd ever be able to put them all together as one big thick book either, because one, it would be incredibly expensive, and two, you'd probably need a truck to take it away, because I mean it would be nearly 1,000 pages. It would be insane. But I can dream, and that's what I dream of. One day, maybe some enterprising publisher say, yeah, you know, we're knocking it out for the remainder market as a 3, and I'll say, okay, then let me go at it, and I'll mix them up and make it into a new omnibus book, and that's kind of fun if you can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Any other exciting things you have coming down? I mean, we're at the end as we're recording this. It's almost Christmas 2022. Anything exciting coming in 2023 that you want to share with anyone?
When I turned 60 years old, which was nearly 10 years ago now, I said, that's it. I'm stepping back. I was tired of being on the treadmill, doing book after book after book after book. Because I say, I've never been paid huge amounts of money for my books. I've been paid a reasonable amount of money, and invariably most of them have made that money back. I've done more, and over the years. And one of the great things, you mentioned it in passing earlier, is never give away the rights to your books. Never sell the rights to your books if you can help it. Because one of the things I've been very lucky about is books I did 20, 30 years ago have come back into print again and again and again, or have sold to foreign markets, foreign language markets. So I'm still earning money from books I did 30 years ago because they're back out. I mean, there's a pile over here which I've got to send out after Christmas. This is a a book I did back in the 90s called Shadows over Innsmouth, which was a series of H.P. Lovecraft tie-in anthologies. This is a Polish edition, which just came out a couple of weeks ago here. Look, I mean, it's huge. With H.P. Lovecraft on it. And it's a lovely book. It's, you know, it's spot embossed. But of course, I've now got to send one of these to everybody who's in the book. That's my job as the editor. So that's a lot of sorting out envelopes and mailing things over Christmas. But it's great. I mean, this book has never been out of print since it came out in 1994 in one edition or another. It's stayed in print in Britain and America and now in foreign editions, which is great. And that's what you want as a writer. But I said, yeah, you know what? I'm going to get off that thing. I'm just going to work on books I want to work on. I don't know how many years I've got left. I just want to do stuff. I've got stuff I want to do. I've got stuff books I've always wanted to do, and there's still books I want to do. And what I didn't realize was there were quite a lot of books I want to do. Yeah, I finished doing. I did a series of books. I don't know if you saw them. Best New Horror, which was a series of books I did. An anthology series. We did 31 volumes. This is volume 31, which came out this year. And I said, that's it. 31 volumes breaks the record for the longest running horror anthology series of all time, which was the Pan Book of Horror Stories in England, which ran for 30 volumes.
Wow.
So I said, when we get to 31, I'm stopping, because it's a lot of work. I mean, it's 600 pages, one of these a year. You had to read all the material. I had to write a long introduction about the year. And one of the things I did in the back with Kim Newman was we had a necrology of all the people who died in that particular year, which was a lot of work. And so when I finished doing the Best New Horror series, I thought, that's great. I can get on with some of my other books now. And then, of course, COVID happened and lockdown happened. And everything shut down. But people didn't stop dying. People were still, you know, famous actors, actresses, writers, artists, everybody. So about 3 months into the COVID thing, I suddenly realized that these people were being ignored. You know, there are thousands of people dying all over the world. So nobody cared if a B-movie actor in his 80s died in Hollywood or an Italian peplum actor died or whatever. So I started posting obituaries on Facebook of genre-related people, whether they were technicians or actors or artists or writers or whatever. And people really got into this. I still do it today. I did 2 this morning before we did this interview. And I kept it up. And then earlier this year, a publisher came to me and said, have you ever thought about collecting these into a book? I went, no, not at all. I said, yeah, I just did it so that people realized that these people were still out there and they deserve some kind of tribute. And he said, well, look, I'd love to put it together as a book. And I said, sure. And it meant I had to go back and do the first 3 months of that year. And so we brought out the Alchemy Press Book of the Dead 2020, which was basically, you know, little mini bios and tributes to the people who died in 2020, basically keeping their stories alive and whatever. And then immediately afterwards, we did the Alchemy Press book for 2021, which again is a paperback, looks lovely. But this time we actually did all the poster work. I got one there. Yeah, we did it in color.
Yeah, nice.
So it's nice. So of course, this year I'm working on 2022.
Dude, just when you thought you got out of a yearly book.
So now that will obviously finish probably the first week of January, when I'll be able to tidy that all up. And I've been building that up as the year goes on. And so around about the spring this year, we'll have the next one out, the next volume out. But they all fit together. They're nice little, I call them bathroom break books. It's like, you know, if you want a book in the bathroom while you're in there, you talk about, you know, dipping in and out of a book. These are the perfect books to dip in and out of, because you just open up and go, oh yeah, I've heard that. I recognize that face, or I know that name, or oh, this is what they've done. Oh, you know, little stories about them or whatever. Well, and often I'll do it. I'll go like, I didn't know that person was still alive. I thought they died 20 years ago. And you discover, you know, there's some actor in their 90s who hasn't been on screen for 20, 30 years, but who's still out there. still out there doing stuff, which was great. So that was all kind of cool. I also been doing recently, I've been doing collections of authors' work, which I thought needed to be brought back into print. This year's one. We have a British author called Lionel Fanthorpe, who used to have, he's probably the most prolific author in the world. He used to do books in the 1950s and 60s for Badger Books, which were known for their yellow spines in the day. And he's still around. He's still alive. He's in his late 80s, early 90s now. And so we worked on this book, which is a collection of brand new stories in the vein of the stories he used to write in the 1950s and the 1960s. And this came out from PS Publishing this year. And the lovely thing about these books is we don't only do the paperbacks, but we do signed limited hardcovers and slipcases for the collectors and that kind of thing as well. So the book I've just finished literally today is next spring. I'm doing a book like this of Robert Silverberg's horror stories. Now, Robert Silverberg is known as a master of science fiction. But back in the 50s, he wrote quite a lot of horror and monster stories, most of which have not been reprinted ever. So we've put all those together in a book and illustrated it and whatever, and that will be coming out next spring, which will be great. I've got a series here now. We realized that I could retrofit a lot of my books into something called Stephen Jones's Masters of Horror series. So a lot of the books I did earlier are being reprinted in new editions with that banner. And then all these new books are coming out from PS Publishing with that on. And the first one next year is I've done a book on King Kong, for the 90th anniversary of King Kong. But it's based around Edgar Wallace's original screenplay for the film, not the screenplay that was finally used. I got access to a copy of Edgar Wallace's original script. And I thought, wow, this is really fascinating, because if you know the story, everybody, for many years, it was put out there that Edgar Wallace barely did anything. He died before the film ever came out. And they put his name on it just out of tribute to him and whatever. And in fact, that all turned out not to be true. He wrote a full script. Lots of the stuff in his original script is in the final movie or adapted for the final movie. And so I thought, it's time to set the record right. So I've done this book, which is illustrated. It's got some really great storyboard material in, and concept artwork, and some original artwork by Bob Eggleton. He's a big Kong fan. And so Kong, the original screenplay, is coming out next spring to celebrate the 90th anniversary of King Kong. And that was Kong's my favorite film. It's probably the first horror film I saw as a kid. And it was shown on TV here in the mid-60s. And so that was a labor of love, just putting that book together. I probably won't be around for the 100th anniversary, but I thought, hey, get it out now while it's the 90th anniversary. So yeah, I'm still busy. And then I've got this new, not the Art of Horror book coming out, I've got to work on next year. And I've got a big 3-book set to do for the end of the year, which again is another tribute book, which will all be in a slipcase. So yeah, I'm keeping busy. And then lots more commentaries, including the Hellraiser. I'm doing commentaries on the first 3 Hellraiser movies next year as well, with Kim Newman. So we've got new Blu-ray versions of those coming out next year as well. So there's a lot to do.
So I'm curious, those new versions of the Blu-ray, are they coming out in the UK, the US?
These are UK ones. I think they've already been done in the US. I think Pete's done commentaries on some of those, but this is Arrow in the UK.
Oh, Arrow, they do great work. Yeah.
So we're doing for Arrow. We'll be doing commentaries on them, and of course, what I'm doing is opening up my files to them, so they'll be able to use any material I've got. Because one of the things I did do was every film I worked on, not just the Hellraisers, but every film I worked on over the years, I kept box files of material, original scripts, shooting information, movie stills, everything. I've got everything. So I've basically got the archives on all those films that I worked on. So I've said to them, if there's anything you want to do for the special documents or as extras, we can do that. So we've got to talk about that in the new year and see what we can come up with. Unfortunately, all the EPK material, all the video footage I shot seems to have disappeared, except for small snippets of it, which still exist. But I remember going to New World Pictures back in '88, I think it was, in Los Angeles, and taken down into the vaults there. And it was like that scene in at the end of the Ark, at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, where you would expect to find the Ark of the Covenant. And all my footage was down there with all the stills and all the press kits, all the posters of all these cool Roger Corman movies and everything else. And when New World Pictures got sold, and it got sold again, and it got sold again, God knows whatever happened to that material. And it's the same with the Nightbreed stuff. I mean, we shot all that stuff on high resolution videotape here. I've just done a thing for a German release of Nightbreed, which includes amazing extras. I mean, incredible extras, including a lot of my behind the scenes footage that's never been seen before on anything. And that's coming out this next year as well. So for anybody who's a Nightbreed fan, look out for the German release, because it's got hours and hours of extras, including a huge documentary with everybody who was involved, including me.
Very exciting. Well, this is you're a busy guy.
It's nice. I mean, these little side projects, these all nice little side projects, they help keep things ticking along. I've had more than 160 books published now. Yeah, I don't need to publish any more books unless I want to. You read out the list of awards. I don't get awards anymore, but back in the day, I got my fair share of awards and my fair share of nominations. So, you know, I feel justly rewarded. As I say, there's still little bits of money coming in from different books all over the place, different countries, different editions, whatever. So it's been a great life. I mean, it's a fabulous, fabulous life. And it's what I wanted to do when they threw me out of school in the early 1970s. I ended up doing exactly what I wanted to do. And I had no connections. I was just a council estate kid in London. I had nobody I knew in publishing. I had nobody I knew in films or TV. But you know what? If you love something enough, you can make it work for you. And that's what I did.
Well, yeah, great words to live by, and that's fantastic inspiration for anyone who's watching, who's trying to follow their passion. And if people want to learn more about what you're working on, I assume they should visit you at stephenjoneseditor.com. Is that right?
Yeah, except where that the old website, the guy who's running the old website has retired. And so it hadn't been updated for 2 years. So we closed that website down. I think it's closed down now. And we're rebuilding a new one. But when you think of all the material we've got to move across and update and redesign, we're only just starting to do that now. So I'm not sure what people will find. I mean, go and look at you can get me on Stephen Jones Editor on Facebook. There's always stuff going up on there. You can see what the new stuff is all the time. You don't have to. I mean, I don't befriend a lot of people on Facebook because I just can't keep track of everybody. But you can always go on Facebook and have a look and see what's on my page. It's an open page. And the whole idea of the website was really to be a sort of archive. So if you wanted to look up an edition of a book and see how many different editions had come out and who was in it and what the reviews were like and what the different covers were like, that's really why it was there. It was a reference source, and I really want to try and get that back up in some form at some point. But it's a lot of work, and I'm getting old. I'm slowing down nowadays.
Yeah. Well, I'll make sure to keep following along. I encourage everyone watching this to follow along as well. And thank you, Stephen, for your time. This has really been enlightening and entertaining.
As I said, Michael, thank you for asking. I mean, people very rarely ask me for interviews these days because I'm quite happy being the guy behind the scenes. I'm the Wizard of Oz. I'm that man behind the screen. I like being that. I'm not as outgoing as some of my friends, but now and again, it's fun to do something like this, and it's been real fun. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.